Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley, and if you're new here, I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. Now, before we get into today's video, of course, just a little quick reminder to please comment, like, subscribe if you guys are into this sort of content. It really does help grow my channel here on YouTube. And if you guys want more crime, creepy content, check out my TikTok. I will link it in the description box below for you guys. I post a lot more short story format on there. All right, so let's get into today's story. So what if I told you that the movie Freddy Krueger and the Nightmare on Elm Street were actually based on a real life, absolutely terrifying phenomenon? Well, it actually is, and it ended up affecting hundreds of people. And this cult classic drove teenagers, young adults absolutely crazy in the 80s, especially when the first installment came out. And it basically instilled the fear of falling asleep because people just didn't want to have these nightmares or even risk not waking up in the morning. I remember watching this movie, although I was not born in the 80s, I did watch it as I was growing up in the 90s. And the song that's played in the movie, it's kind of like a rhyme. It's kind of like a child's rhyme. It would get stuck in my head over and over again. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, here's a short clip of that song. So of course, if you've seen this movie, many of you are probably thinking, well, that's just completely impossible. There's absolutely no demon in my dream chasing me, trying to kill me in order to take my soul. That's just not happening. Well, you're sort of right and you're sort of not, but that's what we're going to go into in this video. Now, if you don't know who Freddy Krueger is, let me give you a little bit of a refresher. So in 1984, Wes Craven released a movie called Nightmare on Elm Street that would go on to become a very classic slasher film with Freddy Krueger as the main villain. The story revolves around several teenagers who start experiencing these horrible, horrendous nightmares, but it would turn out that they just weren't any sort of regular nightmare. As they slept, they would encounter this disfigured human beings, humanoid sort of thing that had fixed blade gloves on, and his only mission in their nightmare was to hunt down these teenagers, kill them, and take their souls. The problem here is that if Freddy Krueger caught you in your nightmare, that also translated into real life. So if you died in your sleep, you would die in real life. So as the movie goes on, the storyline ends up revealing multiple teenagers that have to battle basically falling asleep. They have to stay awake for as long as they can because they're afraid of what's going to happen. They're afraid of Freddy Krueger, and basically they have to find a way of defeating Freddy in order to survive. What most people don't know is that Wes Craven actually was inspired by a very real and strange phenomenon that occurred in the 70s across America, but it also ended up occurring across Asia around the same time. But to fully understand the story, we have to go to a different part of the world, and that's going to take us to Cambodia. So between 1975 and 1979, members of the Khmer Rouge had one mission and one mission only, and that was to execute as many Cambodians as possible. Now, the Khmer Rouge, and pardon my pronunciation here, I am going to try my best, please don't come for me in the comments, but they were an umbrella sort of situation underneath the Cambodian Communist Party, known as the Communist Party of Kampuchea, and their leader was the General Secretary Pol Pot. It was said that the Cambodian Communist Party ended up receiving a majority of its help from the Chinese Communist Party, including billions of dollars, interest-free in military aid. And in 1975, once they had taken over control of the entire country, their goal was to turn Cambodia into a socialist republic as well. And in order to do this, they took some sort of extreme measure. So they had ordered non-conforming Cambodians from across the country to be sent off to these very disgusting labor camps in the countryside where mass executions took place. Abusive labor conditions were the norm, malnutrition and diseases were also rampant. These camps would also become known as the killing fields of Cambodia. By the time the Vietnamese were able to invade and remove the Khmer Rouge, it's estimated that 1.5 to 2 million people had died out of a population of 8 million. Just imagine how much of a shock that would have been in decrease of population. And unfortunately, most of its victims ended up being Chinese Cambodians, Cambodian Cham, and Vietnamese Cambodians. So of course, as in any sort of war situation, this pushed a lot of people to flee the country to neighboring countries such as Thailand and Vietnam, but it also pushed people to flee to the United States as refugees. That's where the strange phenomenon begins. In 1981, Wes Craven ended up reading a very shocking article in the LA Times about a family of refugees. They had managed to escape the killing fields in Cambodia and had miraculously made their way to America. And the family actually had a very young son, and unfortunately, he had experienced the war. He had been a victim of the war and witnessed a lot of these atrocities that humans are capable of in these conditions. Because of this, the young boy was having a very hard time sleeping because of how traumatized he was, and anytime he would fall asleep, he was said to have had absolutely terrifying nightmares. Sometimes they were about the war and all of the disgusting things he had seen, and then sometimes they were about some sort of demon entity that was chasing him. And eventually, this ended up leading to him just not being able to sleep because he was simply afraid of what he would see in his nightmares. Eventually, it ended up getting so bad that he would stay up for days on end, forcing himself to stay awake by any means necessary. And then one night, his entire family, including the young boy, were all watching TV in the living room when he finally dozed off. His parents were said to have been so relieved. They were absolutely thrilled that their son was finally getting some much needed sleep. So the rest of their evening goes on as normal, but then a few hours later, in the middle of the night, the family was awoken by these blood-curdling screams coming from their son. Of course, the parents rush over to see what's going on, but sadly, by the time they had reached their son, he was no longer alive. It was a tremendously tragic end to this young boy's life, but it also seemed like a very strange one-off situation. But in fact, it would turn out to be the complete opposite. During the late 70s and the early 80s, there were hundreds of documented deaths of men dying in their sleep during what seemed to be a nightmare. Another victim was named Yong Leng Thao, and he had managed to seek refuge in Portland, not only for himself, but also for his wife and their 8 children, and they had actually escaped from a Laotian refugee camp from the Vietnam War. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Vietnam War, it was a 20-year-long war that took place between Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos between 1955 and 1975. Essentially, the reason they were fighting, it was a battle between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, where the North was communist and the South was supported by the USA as an anti-communist party. During this war, it was estimated that up to 3 million victims lost their lives, with most of them being Cambodian and Laotians, and of course, US military soldiers. At the end of the war, millions of refugees had escaped wherever they could, including America. So we go back to Yong Thao, and as you can imagine, he was also having a really hard time dealing with what he had experienced during the war, and he was also suffering from PTSD. And on one particular evening while he was at home with his wife, they were watching TV before he ended up falling asleep. In the middle of the night, his wife woke up because of some odd noises. It was Young, and he was breathing quite heavily, and he was also breathing very fast, like abnormally fast. After a few seconds, it dawned on her that he was probably having some sort of nightmare. So she tries to wake him up. She tries shaking him several times, but it was absolutely no use. And within minutes, Young had passed away. And that incident was far from being the last one. In 1978, there were 13 recorded deaths of Laotians passing away in their sleep across several states in the USA. Then in 1981, there were another dozen deaths that came across with the same condition. So what is happening? What is causing all of this to happen? Well, at first, the families of the victims had absolutely no idea what was happening to their loved ones. Was it a medical condition, or was it something more spiritual or even paranormal? Many of the families did have deep spiritual beliefs, which led them to believe that this was some sort of punishment from their dead ancestors from where the men were from. It was widely believed that these men were being punished for leaving their homelands by their ancestors. Another semi-medical explanation that was given at the beginning was sleep paralysis, which is a whole other phenomenon, that is heavily debated. What happens during sleep paralysis is quite terrifying, especially if you ask anyone that's experienced sleep paralysis. It always happens when someone is asleep or in that weird state between awake or asleep. Victims will state that out of nowhere, they're essentially becoming paralyzed, not being able to move or even talk. However, that part is only if you're lucky, because other people actually report seeing very terrifying things in this sort of situation. So some people claim that when they're going through sleep paralysis, they end up feeling this immense pressure on their chest, as if something unseen is sitting on them. Others experience a choking sensation when they feel invisible hands kind of cuffing their necks, and then they're not able to breathe. But that's not it. If you're really one of the unlucky people that experience the worst kind of sleep paralysis, you'll likely end up seeing a sort of demon, or some people end up seeing a witch-like figure that approaches them in the darkness. And she's said to be very old looking, have very long fingers, very long nails, very long hair as well. And all she does is approaches you while fear literally rushes through your entire body. But at the same time, you're completely paralyzed and cannot do anything about it. I unfortunately have been a victim of sleep paralysis. It actually happened to me quite a lot when I was much younger. I don't experience it so much anymore, thank God. But when I was younger, I would be sleeping in that in and out phase, and then all of a sudden I would be completely paralyzed. I would feel like there was something holding down my wrists. There was usually something holding me down from my chest as well. All I could really do was shift my eyes from left to right, and I could see that I was in my room. Nothing had changed, but all I knew is that I couldn't move. I did not end up seeing any sort of sleep paralysis demon, thank God, because I don't know what I would have done in that situation. But my sister, on the other hand, has seen something very strange when she experienced sleep paralysis. Whenever she would be sleeping, she would see this sort of witch hand come across from behind her, almost as if she were hiding behind her when she was sleeping on her side. It would reach over, coming towards her mouth and neck area. But anytime that would happen, coincidentally, she would kind of be released from this paralyzed situation, and then she would be able to wake up just in time. So if you've ever experienced sleep paralysis, let me know what your experience has been like in the comments below. But back to the story. So different cultures have different legends on this experience, and what it comes down to is that sleep paralysis could potentially be some sort of malevolent spirit or demon that attacks you at your most vulnerable when you're sleeping. It's believed that this spirit is there to claim your soul, and the only way to truly survive is through prayer. But of course, the medical industry just couldn't accept this sort of paranormal explanation of what was going on. They just simply believed that there had to be more to this story. Unfortunately, as much as doctors tried, they just could not pinpoint exactly what was causing all of these deaths. And so they gave it a pretty vague name. And today, it's actually called the sudden unexplained nocturnal death syndrome. And to further prove that something serious was going on, countries across Asia were also experiencing the exact same thing and ended up giving it a similar name. Now, although this phenomenon was given a name, it didn't explain what was going on. It was just too odd of a situation for people to really figure out. Now, for example, in Japan, they ended up calling the pokuri, which means sudden unexplained death at night. In Thailand, it was referred to as lai tai, which means die during sleep. And in the Philippines, it was referred to as bangugat, which means moaning and dying during sleep. All doctors could really chalk it up to was some sort of form of cardiac arrest resulting in death, or some sort of heart attack, or even a heart arrhythmia that was likely triggered from fear. So essentially what doctors were saying is that these men and these young boys were having terrifying dreams, likely of the wars or the genocides that they had witnessed, and they were quite literally being scared to death in their nightmares, which resulted in them dying in real life. And that is exactly what gave Wes Craven the basis for the storyline of Nightmare on Elm Street. Alright, so that's it for today's video. I know it was a quick, short video, but I thought it was quite interesting and I wanted to share with you guys. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I will see you guys in my next video.